Thanks, Michael, and it's a pleasure to speak to the 2% who would get all four answers to those questions right. I first spoke about the issue of rapid population growth and the need to stabilise our population in 2009. Since that time there have been some successes. The baby bonus was abolished and the upward march of net migration has been arrested. But from my perspective, the outcomes have been largely disappointing. That step change in net migration from 100,000 each year in 2004 to 200,000 a few short years later seems to have been locked in, and Australia is very much on track for the 36 to 40 million population by mid-century that has become known as Big Australia. We had a national debate about population in 2009 and 2010, and notwithstanding the occasional report or article nowadays, a la Josh Gordon, which does focus on the population question, generally it is little discussed in the mainstream media and opinion pieces. It is my strong and clear impression that opinion leaders in politics, in business, in the media and in many non-government organisations do not want to talk about it, and that they have been very successful at sweeping it under the carpet and suppressing efforts to make it a significant topic of public debate. So, what are the challenges to getting a serious debate about this issue, and what are the obstacles to action? The first obstacle is business, the big end of town. They always want more people. They will never say that we have enough or too many. This is for two reasons. First, because they want more consumers to sell their product to. The property development and construction industry is the most conspicuous cheer squad for rapid population growth, but most business has the same mindset. Second, one of the key sources of more people is migrant workers, and business wants them in order to put downward pressure on wages and conditions so they can get cheaper labour. The temporary migrant worker schemes are particularly appealing to them in this regard. In Australia right now we have over 1 million workers on temporary visas which give them work rights. Many of these workers aspire to stay in Australia to become permanent residents, but if the employer says they don't require them anymore, they can be required to leave the country. So they are extremely vulnerable to exploitation. That's how we get scandals like the 7-Eleven one, where workers work 40 hours but are only paid for 20. If business represents the problem from the right, the view from the left is not much more encouraging. Over the years, what I call identity politics has become ever more dominant within the left. In the past, political debate in Australia, and in many other countries, was dominated by the struggle between capital and labour, with issues of workplace relations and the distribution of national wealth, what we might crudely describe as class warfare, being key. But in the last couple of decades, we've seen much of the political and social debate revolve around issues of race, gender, sexuality, religion. I got robocalled a week or two back by a pollster. They ask you these questions. You have to press button 1 and press button 2 and so on to answer. And they asked, what issue is most important to you? And they said, if it's marriage equality, press button 1. Asylum seekers was button 4. The distribution of wealth between rich and poor and the environment didn't rate a mention. Now, in this atmosphere, politicians and people are very sensitive to allegations of racism. As I've said before, it's become the new McCarthyism. The supporters of rapid population growth are just itching to use it to shut down debate on this issue. I saw it when we had the debate over the China Free Trade Agreement, when trade unions quite rightly raised the concern that the FTA did away with the need for labour market testing for dozens of trades and basic skill level occupations, and thereby opened the door for migrant workers to be brought in to do jobs which Australians were ready, willing and able to do. They were accused of being racist. None of us likes to be called racist, so politicians shy away from talking about it, even those who know it is a problem. It is a ridiculous attack. Australia is a multiracial country right now. More than 1/4 of Australians were born overseas, and more than 1/2 had one or both parents born overseas. Ironically, that in itself acts as a barrier to action. Many migrant communities are active in the Labor Party and actively involved in sending delegates to state conferences and in pre-selection contests. The temptation for Labor candidates and office holders to court their support by loudly and uncritically proclaiming the virtues of migration is largely irresistible. The Liberal Party is headed down the same path, and the more multiracial Australia becomes, the more people of different backgrounds end up in large numbers in the electorates of all political parties. But, of course, to ask whether migration is good or bad is absurdly simplistic. The question is not, is migration good or bad? It is a question of what level of migration is appropriate for Australia's particular circumstances. One apple or piece of chocolate a day is one thing, but a dozen. The Greens Party, as a party founded out of concern for the environment, ought to be the ones to expose and blow up this identity politics, but they do not. The left of politics used to think in terms of making each society more equal and fair, but in our globalised world, they seem to have given up on pointing out the shortcomings of the free market and largely embrace it. Indeed, for some of them, their idea of dealing with global inequality and global poverty is what I would describe as open borders, and Mark referred to this, allowing people to move from whatever country to whatever country they like. Sometimes it's expressly stated, more often than not it's just a hidden assumption. And either way, and Mark, I don't wish to trample on anyone's dreams, but until further notice, open borders is nuts. In the first place, electorates the world over will not accept it. They would prefer to vote for Tony Abbott than Sarah Hanson-Young. They would prefer to vote for Donald Trump. They would prefer to vote for the UK Independence Party rather than have it. And secondly, if we did have it, it would be a catastrophe, wrecking successful societies and doing nothing to deal with the problems in the failed states and conflict zones. Angela Merkel embraced it. It was a win for the people smugglers and a disaster for Europe. But the siren song of open borders and the Greens' use of the asylum seeker issue as one of their recruitment tools has stopped them from getting serious about the issue of rapid population growth. That is a shame. We could increase the refugee intake within the context of a substantially reduced overall migration program, as I argued in my 14-point plan years ago. The third obstacle to action is the use of economic growth as our key performance indicator. It means that Treasury and Government are so preoccupied with getting a high growth number that they are prepared to cheat. Like an athlete or a footballer taking performance-enhancing drugs, they go for population growth to bump up the numbers. Now, population growth increases GDP all right, but it doesn't make us wealthier any more than having people living in the street by building a high-rise next door makes us personally wealthier. To the extent that GDP is a valid measure of success, which is a topic in itself, it must be GDP per person, GDP per capita, GDP per head, and we need to make this point constantly to discourage this cheating. The final obstacle to action is in many respects the most difficult. I've concluded that as a species we are prone to vanity. We like to believe that we could not possibly be the problem. If there is a problem, it's because of the system or our evil political leaders. People can't possibly be a problem. I understand perfectly well the pressures on politicians to be sunny and optimistic and the rewards for being so. If you think of Ronald Reagan, it's morning in America, or Malcolm Turnbull, there's never been a more exciting time to be an Australian. You look at how cheerful Barack Obama or Bill Clinton are, and you understand the lack of attraction in being the glum killjoy who says things are crook and getting worse. So, given those obstacles, people are very tempted to embrace any issue but this one, and most do. And given that, I commend you all for being here and willing to tackle what is in many respects the toughest policy challenge of them all. So, how do we do it? Well, first, we have to call out this vanity for what it is, just vanity. In particular, we have to denounce the idea that people can't be the problem or there can't be too many people as ecologically illiterate. One of our problems is that many people have a limited understanding of Australia's ecology, that we are largely desert. We need to push for environmental education in schools and lift the standard of ecological awareness. We should complain about the extent to which media interview economists about the issues facing the nation when they should be interviewing ecologists. We need more ecologists and fewer economists. Second, we should have as many arguments as we can about population start with a debate about global population. Now, I know many of us want the debate to be about Australia, and we're absolutely right to be concerned about Australia. Our population growth, as Cathy mentioned, is very high, and I worry that we are approaching a tipping point like some other countries who are now basket cases did a century ago. As you know, exponential growth is the issue. If you grow at 7%, you will double in just 10 years. But partly because of the lack of ecological literacy that I just referred to, many people have a better capacity for understanding that the world has a population problem than they do that Australia has a population problem. So I think we should start as often as we can by pointing to the global population problem, that is that we've gone from 2 billion people a century or so ago to over 7 billion now, tracking for 9 to 10 billion by mid-century with no sign of abating. Then they say, our response should be to say that each country has a role to play in tackling this, and each country should move to stabilise its population, and Australia has to play its role by doing the same. One of the most obvious manifestations of the misery caused by global population growth is the worldwide flood of asylum seekers and people seeking a better life elsewhere. I think about this terrible problem a lot, and I'm sure that we all do. After the Second World War, we set up the United Nations and then the United Nations High Commission for Refugees to stop this disaster. To say that they have not succeeded would be an understatement. A key reason they've been so ineffectual is that the permanent members of the Security Council have a veto power over action, and they use it to block action which the UN could take to solve conflicts. And I think that they should be accountable for this failure and neglect. I think the other countries of the UN should demand of the Permanent Security Council members that they set up refugee camps to take in all the refugees, all of them, from conflict zones for the duration of the conflict. That would give those nations some real accountability and some reason to act to resolve conflicts as soon as possible, rather than letting them fester as they've done in Syria and other places. Even better, they might act to stop the conflicts from breaking out in the first place. One of the things we need to do more of is to make contact with like-minded people in other countries. I know that language is often a barrier. Recently I found a like-minded MP in the Nigerian Parliament. It would be great if we could bring him out to Australia to talk about population in Nigeria, which would help get the debate to where it needs to be. And then we need to build up a database or databases of like-minded people. I have one of people who've contacted me over the years to support my position on population issues. We need to be mindful of rules and proper practices regarding privacy, of course, but subject to those restrictions, work to find people who agree with us and involve them in action. Fourth, we need to get involved in issues which are the consequences of rapid population growth and use them to stymie the big end of town agenda and build awareness of the link to population growth. I'm thinking of issues like the planning issues, high-rise apartments and so on, traffic congestion, opposing developments and projects that damage the environment, unemployment, abuses of 457 visas, workforce deregulation, skills and training. I'm thinking about the free trade and globalisation agenda of the big end of town, of which the free movement of people is an important element. In free trade agreements, Australia has been giving away our capacity to determine our migration policy promising not to carry out labour market testing and so on. Ironically, the United States, the land of the free, the home of the free market, has legislation which expressly bars trade deals from restricting its migration policy in any way. I don't think we should support the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which handcuffs future government policy making and particular migration policy making. Now, I know that some people get very frustrated when they think that we are getting off the topic. They want us to stick to population. And they say, not unreasonably, that population is the underlying problem and that everything else is just a symptom. And I get frustrated too. But given the things that we're up against, which I outlined earlier, I think we have to get people interested in our issue by first getting interested in theirs. I was very influenced by a great talk by Richard Dennis from the Australia Institute in Canberra some years ago, where he said one of the reasons that corporate Australia had succeeded in imposing its agenda, including high population growth, was that it did not argue for its agenda based on what it wanted, increasing profits. Didn't go out and say, that's why we want to do this. They couched it in terms of what other people wanted, such as more jobs. I was always attracted to free education, both for university and TAFE, and to support for Australian manufacturing. But my journey on the population road has made me a vehement supporter of the Gough Whitlam legacy, particularly no uni fees. He cut migration, by the way, and said that he didn't think that Australia's population should increase much. It's also made me an even stronger supporter of the Australian settlement of the turn of the last century. We used tariff walls to secure good wages for our workers, and we did our own dirty work rather than bringing in an underclass of migrant workers, or even slaves as the US did, to do it for us. The fact that the White Australia policy is now long gone, as it should not be cause for disparaging the Australian settlement, which is a key reason why Australia is a prosperous country and many others are not. And as a general proposition, we need to be prepared to value and defend the past, which I frankly think is easy. I look around at the ice epidemic, the mental health problems, the domestic violence, the homelessness we have today. I compare the prospects that I and my generation had with the casual work and job insecurity, the housing unaffordability and the student debt of my children's generation, and I think it a no-brainer. We had a better time of it. Just as my journey has led me to value the past more and appreciate the good things we've had, it's also made me a believer that small is beautiful. Bigger is not better, especially when it comes to things like council amalgamations, which make each one of us less important. We need to be prepared to take on the media, including, perhaps especially, the ABC, who run the identity politics I talked about earlier, and make them accountable for their role in the social and environmental problems which rapid population growth has caused. We need to take the population issue to state and local governments. At the moment, it's their heads on the chopping block. Voters are throwing out state governments and local councillors at an unprecedented rate due to their failure to deal with the planning, infrastructure and other problems created by rapid population growth. At present, state and local governments drive the getaway car for the federal government, but they are the ones being arrested and found guilty. If they had more brains, they would refuse to drive the car. And we should tackle the various institutions who are involved in providing unemployment services or housing services or Indigenous services or overseas aid, the environment groups and so on, and point out to them, politely but forcefully, that while ever they run away from talking about population, notwithstanding their best efforts, they will never be able to solve the problems they say are so important and seek our support for. Big challenge? Well, you betcha. But you knew that already. The great US advocate for African Americans, Frederick Douglass, said, "It is better to say what you believe and incur the contempt of the whole world than say what you do not believe and incur your own contempt." And George Bernard Shaw said, "The reasonable person adapts himself to suit the world. The unreasonable person insists on adapting the world to suit them. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable person." Thank you.
very much, Kelvin. Are there 3 quick questions? And those who don't get the questions in now, there's also the panel plus future. So, top left at the back there, and then Jonathan next to him.
Thanks. Kelvin, you've been a member for Wills for a very long time, and if I might say so, you've been one of those salt-of-the-earth politicians that seem to be sadly lacking these days, a people's politician. Has that put you in a place to know your constituents' views on population more than it would other politicians?
I have been able to talk to a lot of people over the years over lots of issues, including this one. In relation to my particular electorate, for years some people have sort of said to me, you have a highly multicultural electorate, with a kind of question mark, as if my electorate was going to rise up and kill me for saying the things that I have. In fact, my office, right from the time I started talking about this, received calls from people of Chinese or Turkish background and the like, saying, you tell Mr Thomson to keep it up. We came from Shanghai or from Ankara to get away from this kind of thing, so we don't want to see the place wrecked here. But for the reasons that I've explained, population has been a difficult sell as an issue. I think many of my colleagues are quite well aware of public opinion in relation to it, but deliberately choose to walk by on the other side. And in terms of career prospects and so on, I'm not sure that I could advise a young MP to say, listen, go hard on population, it'll be good for your career. I don't think I could look them in the face and give that advice. But I do think that politicians and political parties do have an obligation to represent their electorates and the view of their electorates, and that's something that I've tried to do. I also think that if mainstream politics fails to take into account community concerns about some of these things, that nature abhors a vacuum, and that there's a reaction somewhere. And in Australia we had 20 years ago Pauline Hanson, and she was not smart enough to pull it off. But in some of the other countries, you look at what's gone on with Donald Trump, who's got he doesn't need the campaign donations, so he's got that kind of independence, or the UK Independence Party, or the populist anti-migration, anti-Europe parties of Europe, and you just see this reaction, and you even see some of this stuff on the left too, with Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn, reaction to mainstream political parties failing to adequately respond to people's needs and failure to look after their best interests. So, if we fail to listen to people, it seems to me that sooner or later there are consequences.
So Jonathan's right, just there. Jill just at the back here in the grey shirt. I'll make sure you're third.
Thank you. My name is Tony Jones, Kelvin. Back in 2009, I think you addressed a similar meeting to this, and I asked you the question, were you having any positive effect on your parliamentary colleagues? And you answered optimistically. I understand from what you've said today that optimism may have faded. Is that correct?
I think that's a fair response. I think in 2009 and 2010 there was a very lively national debate concerning population, and the work that Dick Smith and others did in relation to this issue was important and received quite widespread coverage. If you go into 2010, you had the Greens, when Bob Brown was leading them, make some statements opposing the rapid population growth and suggesting a cut in the migrant worker programs. You had the Liberal opposition under Tony Abbott then suggesting that they might cut the total migration program. I think around the time of Easter, Kevin Rudd announced that he would have a Minister for Population and an inquiry into population, which was a response to community concerns about this. And when Julia Gillard became Prime Minister, she said she didn't agree with Big Australia. So, you know, it seemed to me through that period that there was a lively population debate and a pushback against what had happened, which was a doubling and more of the net migration rate. But post that 2010 election, it seemed to me that the pushback from business was very effective. I never did get an explanation from Julia as to why she didn't follow through on the things that she'd said during the election campaign. I think in the hung parliament, her own personal authority was substantially diminished. She had to negotiate everything with people all over the place, and there was considerable internal destabilisation and white-anting of her, and so that may have been a factor. But in any event, the issue did seem to disappear from the political radar. There continue to be concerns about aspects of it, and things like the abuse of the 457 visa program, or abuses of overseas students and working holiday makers. Those things are live political issues. Catherine Betts mentioned some debate about this in 2013. So there are still issues that people want to talk about on this front. I think there ought to be a bit more debate about the size of the family payments, which were ratcheted up greatly by John Howard during the mining boom, and now people say we need to balance the books. You know, we need budget repair, and they look at all sorts of austerity measures and the like. And I think they should look more closely at the family payments. But you're right. I think that the situation has become harder rather than easier.
And finally, the gentleman at the corner there had your hand up first.
I've got a quick comment that's not really a question. You said we could write letters of complaint to the ABC, and of course they're supposed to reply to them. I did. I complained about something that I considered to be propaganda. I received no reply, and I queried that, and I was told that they'd lost the letter. I then persisted in my idea that they couldn't have lost it, and it turned out that they hadn't lost it. I did get a reply, but it was a page full of absolute irrelevant nonsense that had nothing to do with the original question. Obviously they did have the letter, but that's what happens if we do that. So just thought I'd make that comment, but I have tried to do that.
Not sure if there's
And that's a general experience, Kelvin, for many of us who've written to the ABC.
Who should we best escalate a complaint to the ABC to after that? Who should we just escalate?
Well, maybe people should write to MPs and say, listen, I've written to the ABC and they haven't replied. I mean, people write to me saying, you know, I wrote to the Ombudsman about this and received no reply, or I wrote to, you know, the council about this and received no reply. So taking the complaint to somewhere else can work. I also think there's scope for things like ringing into the talkback and that kind of stuff. And if one person is doing it here and one person is doing it there, well, it's pretty easy to ignore them and brush them aside. But if lots of us are doing it, then it's hard.
That's it, but there'll be some questions at the panel time as well. There'll be plenty of time. So thank you very much, Kelvin.